So thank you very much for organizing this. I obviously feel very honored and grateful to all of you. I think this is the best honor that one can expect when your students organize some event to commemorate you. It's working, yeah. Now I think I can hear it. So, there have already been several events. So, thank you for organizing this again. I suppose superannuation carries a kind of specific significance apart from the fact that I am retired from JNU. I don't have a job any longer. But it's also a moment when one can reflect on what one has done and what more needs to be done. So I don't see myself as kind of superannuating in the sense in which, stopping to work. I normally use the word retirement as retirement, right? So one just has to kind of retire oneself and get on to the work that one has planned to do. So I may not be doing a regular teaching kind of work, but I have several projects lined up, actually more than what I'd earlier initially expected. So there are several books that I'm kind of planning to start working on. I don't see myself as a public intellectual, though now I have lots of podcasts and YouTube kind of videos which are recorded, and I also occasionally speak in Punjabi and have these programs which are recorded by Punjabi YouTube podcasters, and they obviously ask me to comment on issues of public significance, issues of contemporary time, and I do it as kind of what one should say, professionally as I can. If there is something that I can bring to table, based on my training as a social scientist, I try to do that. So there's a wider responsibility that all of us have, and I'm very, very happy that JNU Academic has also been doing that kind of work. So I'm going to be doing more like the work that you do, that is communicating with the larger audience as a citizen, as a human being, as a person. So, but at the same time, it becomes, as I said, an interesting moment when one can reflect back. And when I was thinking about this title, because I think Siddiq had suggested some other title on what was that, Cosmopolitan Kisan or Agrarian Studies, I thought, it's better to kind of provide an overview of my work rather than to focus only on agrarian studies, which obviously is one of the things that I continue to work on. So all these words are critical. There are broadly 5 different terms that are used, or 5 different categories that I've used. Identity is one of them, inequality is another, India is the third, margins is the fourth one, and I think invisibility also is very critical. If one was to think of, you might have thought, why invisible margins? Margins are many, right? Margins, what is margins? In sociology we have this this is also used as a concept. There's a category called marginal man. And it was in the early 20th century, I think 1929, that somebody had proposed this word or this term, that there is a new marginal man in the urban society of Western cultures, and that marginal man is the migrant, people who were migrating from other societies. So you are located in 2 different cultures, and these 2 cultures are kind of, also both of them asking for you to conform with them. You come from one culture, but you are also trying to locate yourself in the new culture. So this also assumes that there is a kind of new world in which at some level all of us are marginal, in the sense that we don't belong anywhere. At some level you can say that you're all in JNU, but JNU also has a kind of cultural universe, and all of you would have come from somewhere else, and that somewhere else could also be more than one somewhere else, and we all the time occupying several different positions, which at some level makes us as individuals who are accountable to different cultures in different contexts in different ways. So marginality at some level is also institutionalized, right? In the modern day nation state system, as we know, when we talk about marginality or marginalities, we think of certain kind of identities, we think of reservations, and we think of caste, we think of minorities, we think of gender. So these are institutionalized marginalities. And these institutionalized marginalities are also in some sense more visible. We can find literature on that. But they're also kind of invisible marginalities. And these invisible marginalities are also at some level significant, in the sense that, as I said, all of us are at some level marginal to, we don't belong to any culture. All of you, if you were to go back to your own community, after having been there, you would feel yourself as not really belonging there. And when you come and go to another country, you also feel you don't belong there. But we also have no option. So this also means that we are all fluid individuals. We are all individualized. We are not really, in that sense, rooted in a cultural context, in a communitarian context. We carry multiple identities, and that's where identity becomes very, very critical. Now, identity again is not a very easy word. It has multiple meanings, multiple invocations, multiple possibilities. Identity was not a question until the 90s. In social sciences, in sociology, people used to talk about identity, but it was only in relation to processes of socialization. When we read Mead and Cooley, that people talked about how, as human beings, we acquire identity of being individual. But in the 90s, there were also these movements which were talking about identities in very different language. So, and then obviously you have this whole process of mobilizations in the Western context, which are called as new social movements, where different kinds of identities articulate themselves. Earlier, the idea was that modern nation states are made of citizens, and as citizens, the only identity, authentic identity we have is that of being citizen, being individuals. Other cultural identities are own private affairs. But these identities also, at some level, structure citizenship cultures. And those citizenship cultures then obviously produce their own marginalities, who becomes, in some sense, the normative citizen, and who remains at some level a non-normative citizen. Like we talk about, say, for example, Muslims in contemporary India, they have to struggle to just be Indians, right? They have to say that we are also part of India. I mean, if you have to say that, that means there is something wrong, not with you, but with the country. So as a nation state, India obviously has a lot to do still for itself if it wants to be a modern nation state. So we are, in some sense, still living with those kinds of identities, those kinds of structures, which in some sense marginalized certain categories of demographics. So these identity movement also became very powerful in the 1980s, and by 1990s social scientists were talking about them. I'm using these words because they also kind of capture my own intellectual trajectory. I mean, even though I also kind of, technically speaking, belong to a religious minority, but I've never seen myself like that. I've never had, I mean, even though my personal context is quite kind of, challenging, in the sense that my family came from other side of the border, which became border in 1947. And when I was growing up, we were very clearly seen as refugees, and being refugee is itself a kind of problematic thing, and it's also an experience of violence. It's not something that one can. So I have those memories of my childhood, but the manner in which our families, again, this partly comes from our Sikhi imagination of self, that you can never be marginal, you can never be alone, you can never be on the weaker side, right? So I think there were lots of things that our families did, our communities did, So I didn't grow up as seeing myself as being any less than anyone else. People of my community tend to see themselves as being more than others, that we have done this for the country, that for the country, and its country is independent because we people made sacrifices, which to some extent is also empirically true. I mean, my own family, for example, they left everything behind, and never ever they kind of looked back and thought of it as something which was unjust or anything like that. I mean, they were again still very proud Indians, and I don't remember my family ever talking about. They were obviously talking about the violence and all the losses and all the struggle that they had to do, at least first 20-30 years. By the time I was growing up in early 1960s, in 60s and 70s, we were not a very rich family, but at the same time, we were never told that we are poor or we are poorer than anyone else. So we always thought that, we were very well off, and not that we had any money in our pocket. We couldn't even buy a bat to play cricket when we were children, because that was expensive and that was waste of money. But at the same time, it was never so a sense of not being there wasn't there. As I told you, I grew up in 1980s. I mean, my education, university education, happened in 1980s. I did my master's in sociology from Pune University, and then I went to Chandigarh, and then I had my first job in Surat, and from Surat I went to Hyderabad. I taught in Hyderabad for 8 years. From Hyderabad I went back to Chandigarh. I taught there for 3 years, and then I came to JNU. And in between, obviously, I've been traveling around, and I've spent some years abroad and doing various things. So this was also a context, a very different kind of context. And I personally, I wasn't, I'm not known to be being very politically active, but I also had kind of, attraction for left-wing activism when we were young. There was something there in the left-wing politics which kind of attracted and inspired lots of young people. It continues to inspire lots of young people even today. So, but that activism, in some sense, visualized society around class, and class was a concept which was easy to kind of visualize. Class means there are rich people, there are poor people. Even otherwise, if you want to talk about capitalism, you can think about what capitalism is, what pre-capitalist societies are. So I remember in 1980s, since I am a Sikh, and 80s was a very troubled period in northwest India. You might have all heard about Khalistan movement. There was this, what was not really a movement as a popular movement as it is made out to be, but it was something which at some level had become extremely influential, in the sense that there was a lot of violence. There were guns that militants were carrying, and there were lots of violence on the streets, but not communal violence in the sense in which we think of Hindu-Muslim violence, but there was a lot of issues that were there. And it was around that time that I go to study sociology in Pune, and partly it was also because I thought, this world is not really making sense to me. The categories that Marxism provides were not really sufficient. There is something more to the world that we need to know. And I'd gone to study sociology with those kinds of questions, that we need to make sense of society. And sociology in 1980s was a new subject. It wasn't really political science, economics. I was a student of economics. So economics was at some level very popular subject, political science, history. These were the usual subjects which people who did arts took. So there are these 3-4 kind of context in which I visualized my own context. One is obviously that there is something to study there as young people. We need to make sense of this world, and this world is complicated, right? And then obviously we all carry our own identities of being, those days gender had not yet become a very significant topic, but obviously being a man or being a young man I could travel. I could go from my place to study in Pune. If it was my sister, it would have been much more difficult those days when I look back. So I could just go alone. I didn't really have much money, and my brother said, okay, I'll give you 300 rupees per month and you'll have to manage with that. I said, fine, I can manage with that. So, but at the same time, there was this passion that we need to make sense of this world, and we need to study, and we need to kind of, look at the complexities. And obviously, as I said earlier, the question of class, and then there is this larger politics, and there are 2-3 things which I think still remember were very, very critical. In this third decade of 21st century, development remains a very big subject, but in our time, development was the subject, right? Everyone thought about living in a country which would be developed, thought about possibilities of having a society which would not have poverty, which would not have deprivations. So development was something that we all thought we need to contribute to. So anyone who became a social scientist thought of doing social science for the larger society. And there was this kind of sense of, it was taken for granted that if you're doing something, what good is it going to do to the society? What good is it going to do to the nation state? Not nation state in the sense in which nationalists would talk about India. It was a very different imagination of the nation state, development-centric imagination, where obviously the first to make claims over the resources of nation state were those who were on the margins, those who were on the periphery of the society, because they are the ones who needed to be brought into the center. So question of inequality was very central, not in the sense in which again we understand inequality today. And obviously people brought various resources, and these were also times of secularist hegemony, right? We grew up as whatever we did as individuals in Sikh family, but we were not in some sense politically allowed to bring our own cultural upbringing to our public life. The public life had to be completely secular. The left movement obviously was averse to any kind of invocation of cultural idioms, and the language of politics had to be a very secular language. And later on I began to kind of criticize this point, because the so-called secular language is also language of the modern West, and the modern West is also a colonizing culture. So it is in this context that when question of local politics in Punjab, say something like Khalistan movement comes up, it becomes a very kind of troublesome moment for different kinds of people in different ways. Somebody like me who is trying to make sense of it, because we are at some level being identified as part of that Khalistan movement just because I am a Sikh. So you could easily be identified with 1984 happened around that time, and I was in Pune, and I had to actually run away from my hostel and find shelter somewhere. So it wasn't something that one could be indifferent to. It was something which was very, very close to us. But at the same time, when I went back to Chandigarh in the late 80s, the left movement there, the left parties with whom we could comfortably identify, was speaking a language which was not very easy to, in some sense, feel comfortable with. They were speaking language of the state. They were speaking language of the Indian state, which was at some level targeting everyone as enemy of the people, right? So there were violent cases. Many of my own friends died on terrorist violence, but the kind of violence that state did was phenomenal. I mean, this movie is not being released. In which, what is that movie called, where Daljit Dosanjh has acted? Punjab 1980s. 84, yeah. I think that movie perhaps carries all that, the violence of the state. And I used to feel very upset, and why are you not kind of confronting the state? And this was very clearly visible at that time. So this was also kind of moment of disillusionment. But at the same time, I wanted to work on Sikh identity, on Khalistan movement, but most people advised me not to do that because it was still a very risky subject. So the second thing, obviously, as I said, was development. And development in case of Punjab and Haryana was at some level also development of agriculture. Green revolution was at some level, if development was religion, green revolution was a very important subsect of that religious movement. So everyone was talking about green revolution. It was a great achievement, and green revolution was transforming everything. So my initial work was on debt dependencies. That's how I started working on agrarian change. I wasn't really particularly keen to do that work, but that seemed like doable, so I wanted a PhD degree, and I thought this would be good, and that kind of came out quite all right. My work was published in Economic and Political Weekly, and it was also debated. Attached labor, I became famous in the circle who were doing agrarian studies in 1990s. There was a debate that I had with an anthropologist from Cambridge called Tom Brass, who was also editor of Journal of Peasant Studies. So my earlier work was known as Jodhka Brass debate, and following that I also published several other papers. Pardon? Yeah. So so the third thing that I kind of became interested in is caste, and that also has its own history. Caste was a subject that was taught to us in the classroom in Pune University. I still remember we had this Professor Valunchkar who used to teach us a course where he taught us Louis Dumont and the theories of caste, which I summarize in the I think first chapter of my short book on caste as tradition. And I still remember, coming out of that classroom, and I was kind of, very irritated with the way caste was discussed. And I was actually not at all inspired by that kind of literature. I thought this is complete nonsense. And by that time, I'd also seen, the Brahminism of Pune city, which was very different from the kind of culture I had grown up in. I thought these are Brahmins who are trying to, in some sense, propagate their own casteism, and has nothing to do with sociology, nothing to do with society, nothing to do with caste. And even though I was not very persuaded by the left-wing kind of conceptual framework, I thought this is certainly not the alternative to question of class. So caste was a subject that was very functionalist, very Brahminical, the way caste was conceptualized in sociology. So I said, no, I won't never work on caste. I remember in my PhD, I obviously saw caste in the village, and I thought that, if one has to study agrarian world, one has to look at class relations. I mean, this was the classical agrarian studies position. Within that also I had disagreements. But the point is that I did not take caste very seriously. It was in 1990, like lots of us were drawn to the question of caste, because when Mandal Commission report was introduced, was accepted by VP Singh government, there were huge protests all over the country, and these people who were protesting, many of them were actually from left groups. And I saw that, and I saw also lots of people who would argue against class and argue for caste. They were writing in newspapers saying that caste is irrelevant, we should study class. And when I looked at that kind of literature, I thought, yes, we need to study caste, we need to take caste seriously. And by that time in 1990s, when I started teaching, we also had gender studies taking off, women's studies becoming very significant. So that's how I thought that if I have to study caste, I must start with my own context. And then when I got the opportunity, I went to Chandigarh. That's where I started working on caste. And I did a kind of survey paper which came out, I think, in a journal published from Pune. It's called Journal of Indian School of Political Economy. And that paper was called Prejudice Without Pollution with a question mark, Scheduled Castes in Contemporary Punjab. And that was perhaps the beginning of a new phase of caste studies in Punjab. So I didn't realize that, I was starting something different. And then I did a survey of 51 villages. That paper came out in EPW on caste and untouchability in rural Punjab. And then obviously there was another paper in Contributions to Indian Sociology. I did another study of 6 villages. Then I went back to my villages in Haryana, where I did my PhD study, and again I looked at caste question, and the whole thing was kind of very different. And then I got this opportunity of doing some work on Dalits in business and corporate hiring. We also went to Himachal Pradesh and did some work on caste on the Hill. That paper was published in EPW, as well as there's another work that I did on Bihar non-farm employment. So they were all at some level dimensions of caste that I was studying, and a lot of it comes together in this book, Caste in Contemporary India. So it is in this context that I have identified these 3 or 4 areas. Question of identities, I kept going back, and I'm hoping to do some more work on question of caste and Punjab, on question of identity in relation to Punjab and Punjabis. I also, because when I was doing agrarian studies, most of the audience or most of the readers were economists. Sociologists thought that this was not really something that we could even understand, because we was talking about debt and credit. They thought this was not sociology. Sociologists were doing village studies. I recently wrote a paper on M.N. Srinivas Remembered Village. All that is there in that village, but somehow people didn't pick up. They thought, this was Remembered Village is a very interesting political economy document. He's talking about in debt, he's talking about attached labor. All those things that I was discussing are there, but somehow they didn't become popular among sociologists. So that's how I started working on the idea of Indian village, and I revisited the idea of village also, and that's again something that I keep working on. So I think I'll stop here, and then after my future projects would revolve around these things. They are still taking shape, and I'll come back to you with progress if I make any.